Hey everybody, welcome back to Organic Chemistry. My name is Todd Rothman, and in this section, section 2, we're going to learn about the nomenclature of carboxylic acids and their derivatives. Now, let's first start there. Let's talk about why do we say carboxylic acid and derivative. Well, if you recall from the previous video, we learned a little pecking order. We learned that the acyl halides at the very top of our list and amides at the bottom. Now, carboxylic acid is the only one that everyone in that list can become, and it can become everyone. So we call them derivatives of carboxylic acid for that reason. Okay? So, and what you'll see is actually from carboxylic acid is kind of like a center point. So let's say you were an alcohol. In order to get to become, let's say, an acyl halide, for example, you'd have to go through carboxylic acid. So most things that are not already in that family, class 2 family, that you go through a carboxylic acid in your path to becoming one of them. Okay? So you'll see that as we kind of wrap up this chapter, and you'll get a better sense of what I'm saying. All right, for now, let's talk about the nomenclature. So these are the different ones that we're talking about, and we'll wrap up with problems. These problems have to do with both section 1 and section 2. Okay? All right, let's start off with the first one, carboxylic acid. Now, carboxylic acid, the way we name them is that we call them an alkane, and then instead of E, we remove the E and write oic, alkanoic acid. Okay, that's our template, alkanoic acid. Now, for example, if you have a, let's say, a butane, like that, 4 carbons, it's a butanoic acid, butanoic or butanoic acid. See that? Okay. Now, you can have things like propane acids, like propanoic acid, but you could also have like dioic acids. Like, for example, let's say I have a carbonyl here and here. So here's prop, but there's an acid here and there, right? So this is called a propane. And then you actually leave the E in, dioic acid. So for whatever reason, you actually leave the E instead of removing the E. So it's propane dioic acid. And that's how you would name that right there. Okay, so you can have dioic acid, you can have trioic acids, but really dioic acid is what we need to know for now for this chapter, and we'll kind of leave it at that. So we have alkanoic acids or dioic acids, right? Now, as far as the common nomenclature, and by the way, so let me give you one example of, let's say you have a carboxylic acid, and let's say over here is a hydroxy group, and let's say over here is a carbonyl, for example. Okay, so do you recall our pecking order, our order for nomenclature purposes, carboxylic acids at the very top. All of these class 2s are at the top of the list. And as far as their nomenclature priority, you don't have to worry about that. But they beat everyone else, like they beat alcohol, aldehyde, ketone, and so on. So if I was to name this, we're definitely going to number 1 to the carboxylic acid. Not to the ketone side or the alcohol, getting closer number to 1, right? It's always going to be the carboxylic acid or any of its derivatives. So this is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So do you remember that when you name a carbonyl, like a ketone or an aldehyde, that's not the parent, it's called an oxo, right? So we have a hydroxy and an oxo. So H before O, so 3 hydroxy, 5 oxo, and then finally, this is a 6 carbon straight chain. So hex, well, you don't need a dash actually. Hexane, remove the E, oic acid. Now, why don't we have to specify where the acid is? I hope you're guessing, because it's always going to be at number 1, right? So carboxylic acids are on an end, they're terminal. All class 2s are terminal. They are always at the end of the parent chain. And that's it right there. So that's an example of a little bit more advanced looking carboxylic acid, right? Okay. Now, another thing that I want you to know is the base form. So how do you name a base form of carboxylic acid? So the way that we name this, let's say we have, I'll give you an example. Let's say we have a, right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So this is a pentane oic acid. Now, if you remove the H and it becomes the base, how do you name it? Well, this is called an alkane. And then again, you don't have an E, so you still have the O, but you remove the ic acid and you add an 8, O8. So this is called an alkane O8, alkanoate, right? And by the way, if there's a double bond, it would be an alkene O8, right? So we'll leave it simple for now, and we'll do practice. So this is an alkanoate. In this case, it's a pentane O8. Okay, a pentanoate. That tells me that this is a carboxylic acid in its base form. Now, another more common way to see it is where we'll actually have some metal or something next to it. Let's say sodium. So in this case, we would call it a sodium pentanoate, pentane O8. So the metal comes before the parent, right? So, and that's always, even with alcohols that are bases, all bases that have metals, the metal comes first. Sodium, potassium, and so on. So sodium pentane O8. And that's how you name the base form of a carboxylic acid. So it's either an alkanoic acid or it's an alkane O8, alkanoate. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about in this section is the common nomenclature. So there's a few things that you just need to know, common names that you wouldn't know otherwise. So you have to kind of just remember these, right? So we know a lot of them we actually learned from the from the aldehyde to ketone chapter. But remember, this is a form. Remember how carbonyl with an H on its side? So this is a formic acid. Okay. If you have a methyl, remember that's called an acete. And if there's an OH here, it's acetic acid. If you have this one you learned about in exam 1, if you have a benzene with a carboxylic acid, that's called a benzoic acid. Okay, that's called a benzoic acid. Now, what if you have a benzene and then a carbon and then the carboxylic acid, right? So this is called a phenyl acetic acid. And so the idea is that we have a phenyl, the benzene's a phenyl, right? There's a phenyl, and then this is an acete group next to a carbonyl. Where's the carbonyl? Well, I wrote a shorthand, but we know this is a carbonyl right there, right? So that's called a phenyl, and this is an acete, 1-methyl carbon, phenyl acetic acid. Okay. And then finally, the last type of nomenclature that you just have to know, common nomenclature, is how do you name a cycloalkane with the carboxylic acid off of it. So let's say you have, cyclopentane that has a carboxylic acid. This is not easy to name, right? Not from our nomenclature, but it's actually not too bad. It's called in this case, in general, it's cycloalkane, right? Cycloalkane. But in our case, it's cyclopentane. And then you just add carboxylic acid. Very simple. So it's named as you would pronounce it, as you would cite it. So it's a cycloalkane and then carboxylic acid at the end. Nothing special there. Cyclohexane, carboxylic acid, cyclopropane, and so on. So just realize that it's the real name of the ring, and then just add carboxylic acid to the end, and you're good to go. Alright, so these are the nomenclature rules for carboxylic acids and for its conjugate base form. The next thing we want to do is we want to talk about the acyl halide, so let's do that now. So an acyl halide, the way that we name this, and everything kind of spins from the carboxylic acid name. So what we do is we call it an alkane. Remember how it's oic acid for carboxylic? You keep the O, but you get rid of the ic acid and you add YL, alkanoyl halide. That's how you name it. So for example, if I have a carbonyl and a Cl, okay, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And of course we know priority 1 is the carbonyl. All the priority 1 is always going to be the carbonyl of the class 2. So, you know, we might have, let's say, a Br here. So we have a 3-bromo. And let's make a double bond. So 3-bromo, 3-butene, right? Or you could write but3ene, same thing. But if there's one, double bond I usually put before the parent name. 3-butene, and then add, instead of E, O-Y-L, butene oil chloride, and you're good to go. See that? So 3-bromo, 3-butene oil chloride. Notice how we didn't have to say where the Cl is because we know it's going to be number 1. Okay? All right. So there's an example of an alkane oil. This could be ane or ene or ine oil, depending on double, triple,